Hi, my name is Zainas Lašas, and I'm an associate professor at Kaunas University of Technology in Lithuania. Today, I would like to talk a little bit about NATO expansion, because there is still a lot of discussions going on about whether the West has betrayed Russia by expanding to Central and Eastern Europe. I think this is an important conversation. We hear a lot of prominent people from Noam Chomsky to Jeffrey Sachs claiming that this war was provoked by a NATO expansion. And I mean the war in this case in Ukraine, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to be more precise. So let's talk about this. Well, first question, I guess, that you would probably ask is, why am I talking about this topic? As a graduate student, a PhD student, I wrote my dissertation on European Union and NATO expansion to Central and Eastern Europe. I wrote a book my dissertation was published as a book by Palgrave in 2010. It is not considering this particular question that we are considering today, but that's part of the reason why I feel that I can contribute to this debate. Important question, am I neutral on this topic? I should say that probably I am not, and I am not neutral, obviously, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But hopefully you will see why I'm not neutral, because there are some particular arguments that make me not neutral. And actually, I am a Lithuanian, and I consider that the choice of smaller countries in international relations also matter. It's not only the US, it's not only Russia, but also other countries matter in international relations, and in general in politics and in the evaluation of politics, if we start thinking in that way. But let me leave this sort of question again open for you to decide whether I am a fair judge or not. So three sort of smaller questions that we will consider today. Has the West promised to never expand NATO eastward? Was Russia a constructive regional actor in the early 1990s? And finally, has the US acted opportunistically in pushing through NATO enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe? Let's start from the first question on these promises. But before we go to promises on NATO enlargement, let me start with some other promises. And this is a promise by Lech Walesa, the Solidarity leader who just won elections in Poland in 1989. And you can see this excerpt is from New York Times, August 21. And in the second paragraph, you can see it says, there seems to be no prospect of an attempt to withdraw Poland from Warsaw Pact, since it assumed that the Soviets would never allow such a move. This was recognized by Lech Walesa, the Solidarity leader, when he hastened to assure the Soviet Union last week that any Polish government led by Solidarity would honor its commitment to the Warsaw Pact, and that the Communist Party would remain in charge of military affairs. Well, this assurance, this promise, obviously was broken. It was broken, quite quickly, because eventually the Soviet Union collapses, and the Warsaw Pact collapses even before that. And so all these promises, they simply lose their relevance, right? Although we could potentially transfer this promise somehow and project it into the future, but it really becomes irrelevant because the geopolitical reality fundamentally changes. We have a new geopolitical reality in already starting from 1990, and then eventually with the collapse of the Soviet Union, uh, by the end of 1991, and that changes the opportunities, mindset, and so on. So obviously, Valenza probably wished not to be under these constraints, but he realized the constraints that were there at the time. And so when we consider the promises of Western leaders in 1990, made in 1990, we also need to consider the situation. I have some quotes, and I usually like to read them out because otherwise your attention gets distracted from what I'm talking, and you're either listening or reading. And so it's good to read it out loud. Then you can both sort of read along and consider what it says. So here is Western German Foreign Minister Hans Dietrich Genscher at the very beginning of 1990 says NATO should dismiss any expansion of its territory towards the east, i.e. moving it closer to the Soviet borders. Then around the same time, a few months later, President Bush says to Gorbachev that, believe me, we are not pushing Germany towards unification. It is not us who determines the pace of this process. And of course, we have no intention or even thoughts to harm the Soviet Union in any fashion. That is why we are speaking in favor of German unification in NATO without ignoring the wider context of CSCE, taking the traditional economic ties between the two German states into consideration. Such a model, in our view, corresponds to the Soviet interest as well. So here he is talking, President Bush is talking also about Germany and reunification of Germany, because that's a consideration security-wise. And you can see this in the next quote where Baker again assures, visits Moscow in February 1990 and assures Gorbachev that NATO will not spread eastward, with the exception of East Germany. Okay, that's something that they would consider. And it says, and the last point, NATO is the mechanism for securing the US presence in Europe. If NATO is liquidated, there will be no such mechanism in Europe. We understand that not only for the Soviet Union, but for other European countries as well, it is important to have guarantees that if the United States keeps its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will be spread in an eastern direction. And Gorbachev says, okay, sort of, I want to say in general, we share this way of thinking, but there are some differences, okay? And then he says, obviously, this refers to historical issues, and reunification of Germany raises concerns both for the Soviet Union and for Western allies, European allies like France, and reminds them of what happened during World War II and when Germany gets too strong. So that's the context of the conversation here. And obviously, Baker sort of refers to this and treats the US as this kind of guarantee, and also as a country that can limit the power of Germany and keep it within NATO framework, and so keep it kind of constrained. Obviously, in that context, he also says no plans for NATO enlargement at all. Well, with the exception of East Germany, that could be sort of added, once unified, added into NATO. So that's the map. October 1990, reunification of Germany, and that's how the map looks like at the time. And obviously, the Soviet Union is still there, and nobody nobody realistically considers, from all the sort of key politicians, realistically considers any NATO expansion or possibility of it at this particular point. And so this conversation, I would say it's genuine, definitely genuine, and the promise there not to expand, yes, is the promise to the Soviet leader that is genuine and that is relevant at that particular point. The issue is then that the Soviet Union by 1991, end of 1991, it collapses. And again, the map is redrawn, right? The map, the political, geopolitical map is redrawn, and new realities come up. And new realities both for Russia, both for Central and Eastern Europe, and for others. So that's something to consider because all of this structures the thinking of political elites. So has the West promised to never expand NATO eastward? Yes, it promised. Formally looking at this, there is no doubt about it, but Warsaw Pact, as I mentioned, dissolves in early 1991. Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, but NATO lives on. And actually, it's relevant. It's not just lives on as a sort of formal organization for the sort of dominance of American dominance. Just, if even if you sort of consider that it is sort of some sort of imperial American project, but NATO lives on with the relevance to the Bosnian War, because the European Union tries to resolve this crisis and miserably fails to do that. Americans come in and they try to do this and they succeed. Well, some say more or less, right? Succeed. And also the concerns are not just with former Yugoslavia. The concerns, security concerns and uncertainties are still there in the former in the former Soviet bloc, both Central and Eastern Europe, and also former Soviet Union. That's a whole another ball game that is often ignored but needs to be considered. And that's what I want you to consider now, because we often view, and the view is presented that Russia, here is Russia, this kind of, collapsed Soviet Union and Russia that is looking inwards and not doing anything in the region and simply, observing Americans and Western allies pushing NATO eastwards. But that's not the case. The context is different. Russia is active within its region, neighboring countries. It has ambitions. It actually meddles in its affairs, actively meddles. And so it tries to create its own security mechanism, post-Soviet security mechanism. And so it is not passive. I have just some examples that are here. Nagorno-Karabakh, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Russia is there. Obviously, it started earlier during the Soviet times, but Russia is there as well. South Ossetia War, 91-92, Russia is there. That's in the Caucasus and Georgia. Transnistria War, that's Moldova. Again, it started during the Soviet times, but later on, Russia is there, and not in a very constructive way, not trying to solve some of these issues, but actually to keep these conflicts in this kind of frozen state, similar what happened in the Donbass in 2014. And then we have Abkhazian War, again, Georgia, Russia is there. Tajikistani Civil War, also Russia is there. And the context, obviously, here, bigger strategic thinking is to recreate the Soviet sort of sphere, the Russian sphere of interest in the former Soviet Union, well, with the exception of some states like the Baltic states, but the ambition is there. And in 1992, they sign the Collective Security Treaty. Not everybody signs. There are some sort of debates and issues, but Russia is not asleep, and it is doing its own work to expand its leverage. And so that's important to consider this, because otherwise we get into some sort of trap and very simplistic thinking of what is happening in the region. That's the map for you just to look at as it changed, and then all these sort of various conflict areas where Russia is there and is sort of meddling, or sometimes participating indirectly or directly, actually, if we think, for example, in some of these areas like Moldova, participating in these conflicts. So that's something to keep in mind, and to keep in mind then that both the West and Central and Eastern Europe, Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, and others are looking at this with certain worries, right? And they are looking at this and thinking how to, ensure their own security. Now, one more thing to consider is that even in Russia, there was no sort of single view of the West. It's not that they were sort of looking at the West and even NATO expansion as being some sort of huge threat for Russia. No, this is obviously was more of a not just a domestic question, but it had a huge domestic dimension. And the sort of conflict tension between Russian nationalists, traditionalists, and this kind of more pro-Western liberals. Okay, so we see here in 1993, August, Yeltsin visits Poland, and his foreign minister Kozyrov says that Poland's membership in NATO was not a good idea because it would anger Russian nationalists. But today, as he stood beside the Polish foreign minister, Kozyrov said Russia had no objections if NATO's stance was not aggressive towards Russia. It's up to Poland to decide and up to NATO to decide, he said. So these claims are not indicative that Russia was necessarily happy with NATO, with the idea of NATO expansion, but it was open to consider this, and it was not it didn't view it in some sort of desperate way. At least those liberals, they saw the Western stand in general. They were concerned about about Yugoslavia, what was happening in Yugoslavia to some extent, and the sort of other things. So it's not. It's important to see the sort of internal debates within Russia that were taking place, how bad this is, and whether Russia should really be that much concerned. Obviously, Yeltsin wanted the West to have a more moderate stand because it generated a lot of debates within Russia, political debates. Now, here is another meeting. That's 1993. We see October in Moscow. U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher visiting Yeltsin and talking about NATO summit in 1994. The NATO summit, which proposed a partnership for peace. That's something that came before NATO expansion, and partnership for peace was open to all NATO Council members. Okay, so NATO Council was this kind of consultation forum, and it was open for all of this. And then that's what we see, that Yeltsin is really happy with this idea. And the Warren Christopher is saying, yes, we will propose this in 94 summit, NATO summit. And here is President Yeltsin, second paragraph, jumped at this point and asked if he understood correctly that all countries in CEE and the NIS, newly independent states, that's former Soviet Union, would therefore be on an equal footing and there would be a partnership and not a membership. Secretary Christopher replied, yes, that is the case. There would not even be an associate status. Yeltsin replied, this is a brilliant idea. It is a stroke of genius. That's a famous quote by him for those who study NATO enlargement. Obviously, Yeltsin is very happy with the idea that NATO enlargement is not progressing at all. And instead, we have this partnership for peace. So that's the decision of Clinton, and that's something to consider. We'll look at it, why this is taking place. But first, let's look at the reaction. Obviously, the reaction, Yeltsin is happy, Central and Eastern Europe is not happy. Both Václav Havel and Lech Walesa, they are not happy with this. And they wanted something more from Western countries, more guarantees, more assurances that their situation would not be repeated again, like it was during World War II. So just to quote a quick quote from Lech Walesa, Walesa said, the refusal of the West to issue a clear directive and timetable for NATO expansion eastward would be a major tragedy that would lead to another Yugoslavia in Europe. That's something obviously very clear, right? A very clear position by Walesa that they are not happy with this sort of middle option and that they need security guarantees on a different level. Why is that? Why is that? And why then the West slowly comes around this position? Because we see initially it is not there, right? Western leaders consider, don't think about NATO expansion at this point as a very realistic option, full NATO expansion, okay? And that's something that the West is sort of struggling with, right? It's struggling with two issues. It tries to satisfy both Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. The problem is that Central and Eastern Europe gets the promise of EU enlargement, and it looks much more manageable as a security concern than Russia. Obviously, it's also more relevant for Western European countries, the security of Central and Eastern Europe, because it's their neighborhood, immediate neighborhood, while Russia is a bit further down. And the other thing is that Russia looks less and less, Russia's future and democratic future looks less and less certain. Let me remind you, October 1993, Russian constitutional crisis, a major crisis between President Yeltsin and Duma that is opposed to him. Yeltsin uses military force to disband Duma and have new Duma elections. The results of this new Duma elections, that the most votes were given to Zhirinovsky's Liberal Democrats. They were not liberals by any chance, but Zhirinovsky get 22.9% and becomes the most popular party in Russia. For those who need to understand Zhirinovsky's mind, let me remind you from his party platform, here is also from Washington Post, from his party platform, he says, Imperial Russia, the party, quote, stands for the restoration of the Russian state in the borders of the former USSR. Okay, that's in the party platform. That's one. Two, if you want a bit more amusing story, you can read his statements about nuclear waste. Where down below, where he says, I'll start by squeaking the Baltics and other small nations. I don't care if they are recognized by the UN. I'm not going to invade them or anything. I'll bury radioactive waste along the Lithuanian border and put up powerful fans and blow the stuff across the border at night. I'll turn the fans off during the day. They'll all get radiation sickness. They'll die of it. When they either die out or get down on their knees, I'll stop it. I'm a dictator. What I'm going to do is bad, but it'll be good for Russia. The Slavs are going to get anything they want if I am elected. Okay? That's something to consider. That's something to consider about Zhirinovsky. And the largest party in Russia, the most popular party in Russia at the end of 1993. Furthermore, we have the First Chechen War starting as well, and the future of Russia looks really uncertain, both territorially, the future of Russia, Russian Federation, and democratically. And plus, on top of it, at least when you listen to some of these people like Zhirinovsky, it sounds like it's, it sounds like it has aggressive intentions towards the region around it, right? Trying to restore the former Soviet Union. When you couple this with Yugoslavia, what was taking place in Yugoslavia, and you couple this with sort of history, right, and the concerns that Central and Eastern Europeans have, and they were always raising them and saying, listen, let's learn historical lessons. We were left during World War II without any protection, and, or at least formal protections. And then, we were occupied by the Soviet Union for the next 45 years. So how about today, let's not do this mistake. And these arguments were not that unreasonable given all what is taking place and given the choice that was there between Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. And it was not an easy choice, right? If you provide guarantees for Central and Eastern Europe, then, extra guarantees, then Russia considers this as a problem for them. And if you do not provide, then Central and Eastern Europeans are unhappy and talking about, pointing a finger to Russia and its situation and, these crises that were taking place. By the way, 1993 Russian constitutional crisis, the resolution was far from democratic, obviously, because military was involved. And Clinton essentially turned a blind eye and supported Yeltsin further, despite all these, solutions that were quite dubious in terms of, regular democratic practices. So this context really matters, right? If you don't understand this context, all this sort of NATO expansion debate becomes, really shallow and very uninformative in many ways. And you get this very primitive understanding of these actors as being just sort of either imperialist or, some kind of imperialist. Okay, we'll get to imperialism eventually, a little bit as well. Let's move on. So, as I mentioned, Yugoslavia is something to consider. That's Srebrenica massacre cemetery in Srebrenica, and that's something that was on Western European minds. After all, European Union tried to solve the Bosnian issue. It failed, and so NATO became, with the US at the forefront, became a solution. Whether, we can say maybe a partial solution, it didn't solve all the issues, but anyway, that's something, a mechanism that worked reasonably. One more thing to consider in terms of context, and that's a bit, now we are expanding the time frame, That's 96 presidential elections. That's the second term, Yeltsin's second term, and you see the vote, the first round of voting, and you can see how fragile Yeltsin is, not in terms of health, though he was fragile, but also in terms of support. That's all support that came, that the administrative resources mustered. And in the first round, Yeltsin barely was winning against the Communist Party leader, Gennady Zyuganov. In addition to that, we have Alexander Lebed, that has 14%. We have Zhirinovsky with 6%, almost 6%. So this is something to consider. All these politicians were, nationalist on this more kind of conservative end of things, and more progressive, liberal, pro-Western. Yabloko, Grigory Yavlinsky, had 7.4, and Yeltsin. So that's, again, just a reminder of how fragile everything was, right? And that's the understanding that the West has when it considers this dilemma between Central Eastern Europe and Russia. Finally, and this is the in place of conclusion, is coming back to this kind of imperialist dialogue. Some scholars like Noam Chomsky likes to talk about American imperialism, and he has a right and a point to talk about it. But when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe, they would much rather live under American so-called imperialism than Russian one. For those who didn't know how Russian imperialist looks like, well, you had a chance to look, how they acted or still act in Ukraine when they invaded Ukraine, and how they behaved there and still behave. And so that's why Central and Eastern Europe was very much willing to join NATO, because they knew this, they understood this, and they understood their security concerns, and they were willing to, to be not, they wanted to be under Western banner, right? They wanted Western security, Western prosperity, not the Russian one, right? And so, or Russian variety of security. So you can see the numbers when this is Eurobarometer data, March 1996. If there were a referendum tomorrow on the question of NATO membership, would you vote for or against? And you can see these countries, Romania, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and so on, the large majorities of population, with some exceptions, where Bulgaria, you see less of this, were in favor of NATO expansion. Why? Because they understood the fragility of the situation in the region, in Russia, in Yugoslavia, and they definitely wanted to be a part of NATO. And that matters, so when we consider this kind of imperialism, and we put an equal sign between what we call American imperialism and, let's say, Russian imperialism, these are completely two separate, different animals, right? Or different imperialism. You cannot put an equal sign, because it makes little sense. Because here, these countries, politicians, there was not much debate in most of these countries about NATO expansion. The political elites, the majority of them, large majority, were in favor of it, because they understood what it means for their future. And their will matters, right? So it's not like Americans came and actually forced them to join by power, by brute force, NATO. That's not the case. It's actually reversed. We can see that in the early 1990s, the West was quite reluctant to do anything about NATO expansion and was sort of wavering. At the same time, Central and Eastern Europe and their will matters, right? Because that's a whole thing. If you think it doesn't matter the will of Central and Eastern Europe, and it only matters the will of Americans or Russians, then maybe you have some sort of imperial mindset that you need to look at and consider, because these countries and their will mattered, and they actually actively pushed, strategically pushed for NATO expansion. In the US, they used the emigre communities from these countries, also like Polish emigres, former, from Baltic states. They organized and they pushed their local senators and politicians for NATO expansion. But that was very much on the initiative of these countries. And if you ask them today, all of these countries, whether they are happy to be in NATO, the answer would definitely be yes, because it is not because Russia all of a sudden turned aggressive and it found out, that it wants to restore the Soviet Union. What famously Putin said himself, that the biggest tragedy for him of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. That again shows you the mindset, the way they view the way he views the world, the way a lot of Russian politicians viewed the region, their relevance in it, and their ambitions. So to ignore this and to consider to ignore this context and to consider NATO expansion without it, leads to very primitive and uninteresting answers. So has the West betrayed Russia by expanding NATO? My answer would be no. It has not. And one, obviously, but there are a lot of things here to consider, right? So the answer is more complex, and we need to look at it and understand all the sort of nuances in order to understand how the idea of NATO expansion finally came to fruition. So I hope this was useful. I hope you learned something, and thank you very much.